With Game of Thrones on its way out, what does the future look like for HBO? I'm Elizabeth Wagmeister here with our chief TV critic, Dan Daddario. Dan, how big of a loss is it for HBO that Game of Thrones is almost no more?
Well, I mean, they're certainly hoping that it will have a bright future with its eventual spinoff and people discovering it for the first time, but it's a huge loss. They have plenty of stuff in their arsenal, but nothing compares to the biggest show in the world, one that increases its viewers every season. This is something that people specifically subscribe to HBO for, and I think it's fair to say that once it leaves the air, some of those subscribers will fall away.
Can you talk a bit about just how big of a show Game of Thrones has been while it's been on the air?
Sure, absolutely. I would say big has two meanings here. One is that in terms of its scale and its scope and the amount of money they came to invest in it, the spectacle, the visual effects, the sets, the costumes, there's an unparalleled attention to detail. And HBO has reaped dividends, even though they've been spending a lot of money. Mm-hmm. The other way it's the biggest show in the world is in terms of some kind of alchemy of huge viewership on air, huge viewership online, sales internationally. It's broadcast in pretty much every country in the world, and kind of the chatter it engenders. It makes HBO into a network you have to subscribe to.
Absolutely. Now, there's actually 4 shows in development. One of them, which has had the most chatter about it, is starring Naomi Watts. It's going to actually be a prequel to Game of Thrones. Should that end up getting greenlit, do you think that it'll be anywhere close to the original Game of Thrones, or is that kind of something that can never be touched again?
I would be a little surprised if it were close to Game of Thrones' viewership. I do think that for many people, the appeal of Game of Thrones is this particular set of characters rather than necessarily the Westeros universe. And when you go thousands of years into the past, maybe there's a little bit less excitement about checking it out. With that said, even if it's fewer viewers than Game of Thrones, I really wouldn't bet against the spinoff being a success. Maybe just not the biggest success in history.
Now, you mentioned that it's likely fair to say that HBO could lose subscribers when Game of Thrones goes off the air, but what other shows does HBO have right now that could keep viewers around? I mean, of course, season 2 of Big Little Lies, they're getting Meryl Streep. Will Meryl Streep keep the subscribers at HBO?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's going to be a seismic dip. I just think there are people who subscribe just for Game of Thrones, just as there were people who just subscribed for Girls or for Veep. I think upcoming series like Watchmen, which is an adaptation of the much beloved graphic novel, that has the prospect to keep people around. And maybe Game of Thrones devotees will get really into upcoming shows like Jordan Peele's Lovecraft Country or the 3rd season of Westworld. HBO's invested a lot of energy, creativity, time, and money into epic scale science fiction and fantasy series in order to perhaps capture that magic without repeating every step of Game of Thrones.
Absolutely. Seems like they know the audience that's there with Game of Thrones, maybe give them something else that's similar to the genre or the type of show that they like.
Absolutely.
Now, aside from programming that we see on the screens, HBO has some big changes behind the scenes. Can you talk about the change of ownership and how that also is affecting HBO as we know it now?
Yeah, HBO is likely to really increase the amount of inventory they have because their parent company, Time Warner, was purchased by AT&T that maybe has a little bit less of a appetite for only a few very carefully curated shows and kind of has signaled they want more. The pressure will certainly be on to cook up more programming that does numbers closer to Game of Thrones than to some of their lesser rated awards plays.
Now, you did mention Veep, which brings up another great point. They're not just losing their biggest drama, they're also losing their biggest comedy. Veep right now is in its final season. What have been some other shows that were huge hits that went away, and clearly HBO has been just fine?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of the end of the second era of HBO. The first era of Sopranos, 6 Feet Under, Sex and the City, The Wire, that kind of came to an end, and in 2007, I think, The Sopranos ended. They had a couple slower years, but then soon enough, True Blood came on the air and was a sizable hit. And then in 2011, Game of Thrones comes out of nowhere. It was never supposed to be what it became. It was a bit of a risk, and it ended up paying off hugely. So shows can come from anywhere. They didn't do a Sopranos prequel or a Sex and the City prequel. That's not what got them out of their wilderness period. It was by being creative and thinking of ideas that hadn't been done elsewhere. And I think that'll be what takes them to their 3rd golden age eventually.